Thanks, Dave. Okay, so this chapter is aimed at reconstructing the history of the large herbivore fauna in Hluhluwe-iMfolozi Park and the surrounding areas. And we try to discuss changes in populations in light of human impact and natural regulation. And this is a particularly interesting area to work in with this regard because it has a relatively long history of human occupation and also a relatively well-documented history that span ecologically informative timeframes and also include various political and economic agendas that have driven management policy in the past. So it's also important to look at management impacts on population dynamics in small fenced reserves, particularly because management decisions have such large effects on the populations through fencing and fire reintroductions and culling. And obviously, management aims to try and recreate the functional heterogeneity of the landscape, but it is obviously limited by our understanding of the ecosystem at the time. So what we tried is to put together all of the information that we can find that indicate the legacy of past human impact on the herbivores that you find in the park today. So we took some information from the Middle Stone Age era that you get in Sabuda Cave and Border Cave, which is in the vicinity of the park. It's human shelters that's been where excavations have been continued for the last couple of years. And you see that there's quite a variety of quite a diverse large herbivore assemblage that used to be in the area in general. The extinct species include the Cape horse, the giant buffalo, and the giant hartebeest. And the samples mostly include medium to large grazer species of the family Bovidae, which suggests that extensive grassland habitat occurred in this area during the late Pleistocene. And interesting to note also is that species that have historically been considered non-native to the park is also found in these samples, particularly giraffe, impala, and hippotrophus species. And then from writings of early explorers and hunters, you also see regular mention of species that occur in the park today, including other species that are no longer there, Orobi, for example. Particular mention is made of very large herds of elephant and buffalo, and Delagore given mention is coming across herds of 100 of eland. And curiously, no mention is made of giraffe, which from the archaeological record, it seems as though they've gone extinct or locally extinct from between about 1,000 and 200 before present. And also the mention of impala is outside of the current boundaries of the park. So during this era, because of hunting and trade in wildlife products, this has showed a fairly heavy exploitation pressure on the wildlife populations at the time. And you can see this not only reflected in the chronicles of the hunters, but also in the drop in exports during the later half of that century. Elephant ivory, for example, dropped dramatically in about 1960. And this coincides with the dwindling elephant populations at the time. The last record of the herd of elephant being shot within the confines of the park was on the Hluhluwe-iMfolozi banks in 1890. And similarly, rhino populations declined to very low numbers near extinction. And the consensus seemed to be that eland disappeared from the park around 1880. So because of all these disappearing species, this prompted the proclamation of the two parks in 1895, and the parks remained unfenced at the time, and in the early years it was not particularly managed. There were no restriction on animal movements, so it essentially just acted as a refuge where hunting was restricted. But during those times, disease played a particularly important role in both the protection of wildlife species as well as their eventual decimation. The advancement of humans into the area, or with high human density at least, was impeded by diseases such as malaria and Nagana. Nagana areas basically made agricultural development quite infeasible. So they also acted as wildlife refuge at the time. But shortly after proclamation of the parks, the Great African Rinderpest pandemic hit Zululand, and wildlife and livestock were very affected by this. Cattle losses of almost 70% were reported, and wildlife populations of buffalo, warthog, kudu, bushbuck, and reedbuck suffered heavy losses. And one of the particularly interesting and unexpected outcomes of this epidemic is that the heavy losses of wildlife populations led many to believe that they saw a drop in Nagana and in the distribution of the tsetse fly. So the perception at the time was that this unintended destruction of the fly's food source was an effective way to combat the disease. So the government, under pressure from farmers and the surrounding people, periodically opened the surrounding areas to virtually indiscriminate hunting, and only really the hunting of rhino were consistently vetoed. And this was the first campaigns was in 1929, and this was intensified between 1932 and 1952, when it was even focused to within the boundaries of the park. So by the end of these campaigns, 23 or more than 23,000 grey duiker, bushbuck, and about 17,000 zebra and warthog, 8,000 reedbuck, and about 2,000 steenbuck had been killed. And this is in addition to the regular hunting by resident permit holders. So the Mfolozi stocks at this time had been completely decimated. Zebra and wildebeest had gone locally extinct in Mfolozi, and species such as waterbuck and reedbuck and steenbuck also suffered particular losses. For example, reedbuck had declined by about 50% in Hluhluwe and by about 96% in Mfolozi at the time. So the widespread application of DDT eventually ended the Nagana campaigns, and the wildlife populations gradually began to recover because the parks remained yet unfenced. Animals, particularly from Hluhluwe, where the Nagana campaigns were not as intense, started moving southwards, back crossing the corridor and repopulating Mfolozi. By this time, species such as impala and giraffe had been introduced to Hluhluwe, and they also moved into the Mfolozi area. And as the population started to recover, you can see clear changes in the species composition. Nyala and impala that used to occur in very low numbers started increasing and taking over the once numerous bushbuck populations. So by the middle of the century, the focus of management had once again shifted to protecting wildlife populations, but at the time, the approach to wildlife management was governed or guided by agricultural principles. And one of the central management focuses was to maintain rangeland conditions in a state that was deemed healthy from a perspective of agriculture. With the fences being gradually completed, people began to worry about the impact of this range restriction on veld condition. And an assessment of veld condition in Hluhluwe in 1952 detected what was perceived at the time to be severe soil and vegetation degradation. And this led to the implementation of yet another removal program. This focused mostly on the gregarious species such as wildebeest and zebra, but also on the species that were at the time considered to be in direct competition with white rhino. So if you just focus on the first half of the population trend, which is the red line, you can see many of these species responded with the population crashing after these removals. Only with impala, the picture is not so clear, but if you divide it between the different sections, you can see in this graph the bars are the removals, and the black bars are the removals from Hluhluwe, and the white bars from Mfolozi. So most of the removals were from the Hluhluwe section, and you can see the dotted line is the population trend of impala in Hluhluwe, and it correspondingly crashed and didn't really recover after that. So by the early 1980s, the severity of this culling program and the appropriateness of the agricultural-based approach was called into question, and a new approach based on ecological principles were proposed. This new adaptive management approach required monitoring to become more systematic and more consistent, so it initiated a biannually repeated ground census technique, which was initiated in 1986, and it's still used today. But during the past 3 decades, the park has been transformed in many ways that alters food availability, predator numbers, and the capacity of individuals to respond to these pressures. For an example, the early 2000s, predator numbers started increasing, and this recovery of the predator population is bound to have had quite dramatic impacts on the prey population. And you can see, if you look at the trends for the species that are considered to be vulnerable to predation, the predator increases coincides roughly with a quite dramatic drop in each of these species, although the drops are not exactly at the same time. Specifically around 2008, all of these species populations started decreasing. And you cannot see the same for the species that are considered to be less vulnerable to predation. Giraffe did show quite a low count in 2012, and hopefully when we add the 2014 data, this picture will become a bit more clear. And then also restricting animal movement because of the increasingly high densities of people around the park, and by completing the boundary fences. To restrict the movement of animals obviously limits the individual's capacity to respond to low quality food or low rainfall, and would in the long run also curb population growth. And then changes in the relative abundance of species, in particular species such as ecosystem engineers, should have quite far-reaching impacts by changing the suitability and availability of habitat to other species. So particularly elephant and white rhino, which are both considered to be ecosystem engineers, and they are likely to have had quite far-reaching impacts with such management-driven increases in their populations. So the functional component of the herbivore community has also changed gradually over the last 25 years. While this graph is only reflecting the last 25 years, before the Nagana campaigns, the grazer component comprised about 96% of the total herbivore biomass. Whereas by 2012, this contribution of grazers had dropped to 67%, even though the total grazer community has increased almost, or the total herbivore biomass has increased almost threefold. And this could obviously have long-term consequences on tree grass balances. If you have an increase in grazing pressure, reducing fuel loads and making fires less intense and less frequent. And this could also have been exacerbated by an increasing rhino population, which could have created more grazing laws, which would further decrease fire frequency and extent. But perhaps one of the most interesting changes over the last 25 years is the mounting influence of very large body size. So since 2000, the metabolic biomass of large body size, so animals that are more than 400 kilograms, I almost read 5 minutes, more than 400 kilograms, so buffalo and larger, have increased by about 770 kilograms per square kilometers. Whereas the smaller body size, so zebra and smaller, have decreased by a similar amount, about 650 kilograms per square kilometer. So where you used to have a ratio of 48% buffalo and larger and 52% zebra and smaller, you now have a situation of 79% buffalo and larger and 21% zebra and smaller. And this could also have very long-term consequences on things like plant diversity. If you have an increase in the non-selective feeding that you expect for larger bodied species that are more tolerant to plant quality, you could increase your plant diversity by removing competitively dominant species and giving a chance to competitively inferior species. But if this impact becomes excessive, you can have a switch in the system where you would expect a more homogeneous system because of this excessive impact of unselective feeding. So just in summary, identifying management effects from amongst this backdrop of continuous natural change and predicting whether this management decision will have the intended outcome is obviously a daunting task. But it is a task that can only be approached by having a historical perspective. So rigorous monitoring and continuous critical assessment of management policy is what drives future conservation practice. Thank you. And thanks to Ezemvelo for all the data.